Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast, the official podcast of the Classic Learning Test. My name is Soren Schwab, VP of Partnerships here at CLT, and today we're joined by Dr. Allen Mendenhall. Dr. Mendenhall is the Associate Dean and Grady Rosier Professor in the Sorell College of Business at Troy University, where he also directs the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's the published author of both fiction and nonfiction books, including A Gloomy Peace This Morning, and The Three Ps of Liberty: Pragmatism, Pluralism, and Polycentricity. And I just love me a good alliteration. Dr. Mendenhall's television show, Success Stories, airs on local television throughout Alabama, and his segment, Word to the Wise, appears on Troy Public Radio. He holds a BA in English from Furman University, an MA in English from West Virginia University, a JD from West Virginia University College of Law, LLM in Transnational Law from Temple University Beasley School of Law, and a PhD in English from Auburn University. Dr. Mendenhall recently penned an opinion piece in the 1890 News titled, Alabama Needs the Classic Learning Test, and I'm so delighted to have him on the show today. Dr. Mendenhall, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's a true pleasure. And as we always do, we start the Anchored Podcast by talking about our guest's own educational background. So could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? What kind of schools did you attend at K-12?
Well, you sort of listed the higher education background, but I'm actually a product of public schools, but I had a somewhat unusual and fortunate public school experience. When I was young, my mom was trying to decide whether to send me to a private school or to a public school, and she opened the Bible and just sort of put her finger down. And as skeptical as I am of stories like this actually occurred, and she pointed to Bethel and the word Bethel, and Mount Bethel was the public school down the road, and so that's how I ended up going to public school. But at high school, I pursued Latin. When I got to choose my foreign language, I chose Latin, and I did AP English and was always sort of interested in literature because my grandmother, when I was young, read poetry to me. My mom read books to me. When I was in, I don't know, second or third grade, there were these expurgated versions of the classics that were, they were designed for people roughly my age. And although they were 300 pages, they had big pictures. And I remember reading several of the classics then and falling in love with them. And in those days, you could actually get some sorts of introductions to the classics through television. I remember seeing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a cartoon. Who knows what company produced that, but I remember seeing that and being inspired by it. And so a lot of my education was self-directed. I was always a reader. I can recall being in fifth grade and getting in trouble because I was hiding a book under my desk as the teacher was teaching. Who knows what she was teaching? She was teaching something, but I was reading the book beneath my desk, and I actually got in trouble for that. But I think later teachers probably recognized my love of reading and tried to nurture it rather than suppress it.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's not a bad way to get in trouble, I suppose. Did you know at that point that what you received and what you pursued was maybe not the norm for a lot of public school students in the country, or did you later learn about this liberal arts education or classical education? Thought, well, I kind of got a variation of that.
Well, I don't think I had any awareness of those types of distinctions when I was that age, but I went through certain phases in development and certain periods of elementary school when I loved to read, certain periods of middle school when I loved to read. My dad took me to DC and in middle school, and I was inspired by the museums I saw, and I sort of fell in love with the founding generation and would read about the founding generation and try to conduct myself properly the way someone like George Washington might do. And then probably when I first got to high school, I was in a phase where I was more interested in making friends. And then I had a high school girlfriend who was very academic and very serious about her studies, and she rubbed off on me in a good way, and I studied hard, and I always knew my strengths. I was never a strong math science guy, but I loved literature, I loved history, I loved philosophy, basically any of the humanities. And so it was clear to me where I needed to direct my focus. And I did all the AP classes in sort of those subjects I just mentioned, and tried when I got to college a few classes toward the business core, and realized this is not what I want out of my liberal arts education. I went to Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, which was far less woke in those days than it is today. And I recognized early on that I wanted to major in English. I wanted to study literature. I wanted to read the best that had been written over the course of centuries. And that was how I built my curriculum.
Well, I had to chuckle a little bit when you commented on Furman, which, by the way, not yet a CLT partner college. Shocking to some, probably not so much to you who knows more about that. But I'll come around. I'll come around. So you already alluded to, there's been some change in education. I love your writing. You're such a keen observer of educational trends, cultural trends. So I'm going to start with a very simple, straightforward question. What's wrong in American education today?
Well, there's a long list, but I guess I'll start with saying sort of the catastrophe in American education stems from abandoning aesthetic and intellectual difficulty in favor of resentment, activism, grievance, identity politics. We've replaced the sublime challenge of wrestling with Shakespeare and Milton and Dante with a parade of ideological simplicities. Um, you know, and the true purpose of reading, let alone education, but just reading itself, is to strengthen the self, to commune with the dead, to achieve cognitive and imaginative enrichment. And we've sort of sacrificed all these things on the altar of social engineering. Our students aren't taught to read as solitary thinkers as I was, and I mentioned I had some teachers who encouraged me to read independently. Um, Instead, they're conscripted into various political causes and told that the humanities exist to confirm their predetermined social views or the social views of whoever is teaching a particular class. And this is a profound spiritual and intellectual loss. If we reduce Hamlet or Lear to a lesson about patriarchy, or we read Emily Dickinson or Wallace Stevens through the narrow lens of gender politics, we're committing an act of educational vandalism. I think education is actually fundamentally meritocratic, not like aristocratic in terms of social class, but meritocratic in the sense that it needs to demand intellectual rigor, and it needs to recognize that some books are better than others, some texts are more important than others. I think that our tendency to celebrate democracy has led to a bad form of educational democracy where all texts are considered equal and interchangeable, where you can study rap lyrics or Buffy the Vampire Slayer along Keats and Coleridge and Wordsworth, where you can flatten the distinctions between Taylor Smith and the Divine Comedy. And that's problematic. I mean, certain works just flat out contain more aesthetic value and more cognitive complexity, more wisdom than other works. And we have to have the courage to say that and to make those kinds of judgments, to say this book is better than another book, and to be able to explain why we think that. We need to subject our students to difficult texts and to make them wrestle with difficulty. Otherwise, we're just going to continue our decline.
Wow. There are so many quotable parts in what you just said. Absolutely incredible. And you probably could get canceled for any of these. But I mean, I could not agree more. I mean, I was, I went to Hillsdale, and the professors that shared these treasures with me, I was able to stand on the shoulder of giants, and I feel very privileged in that, because I'm maybe, if I hadn't gotten to Hillsdale, but to, I don't know, Michigan State, then maybe the whole purpose would be to take down the Giants, right? And only find fault in them.
Right.
I think what you're getting to, though, as well, is in your in your opinion piece that I referenced, Alabama Needs the Classic Learning Test. You talked about, you referred to, and I quote, the quiet erosion of educational standards and cultural understanding? And I know you alluded to that a little bit, but speak a bit more about what you mean by that.
Okay, well, I guess there are a lot of things I could say. I mean, one is I think we focus so much on the technical aspect of education, where
Hmm.
even liberal arts colleges like Furman rebrand themselves as career preparation centers, and English departments or philosophy departments or humanities departments have to justify their existence through practical applications.
Yeah.
What use is this uh, subject matter to your career? Um, Writing courses. I taught many writing courses, including composition courses at Auburn, and they're focused on business communications rather than analytical thinking, and critical thinking is reduced to bullet point sort of skill sets rather than a way of being, a way of seeking knowledge. And a lot of it goes back to what I talked about earlier, is in particular in the English departments. Again, my background, my PhD is in English, so I spent a lot of time in English departments as a student and a teacher.
Hmm.
And the emphasis on activism just gets the cart before the horse,
Yep.
because students are encouraged to take these political stances before they actually know anything, before they've developed foundational knowledge. They don't know what they need to be activists about yet, because
Mhm.
um, you know they haven't wrestled with the complex histories and philosophical underpinnings of the social movements that their professors or whoever else are advocating. And I think, ironically, given sort of the triumph of postmodernism and other schools of
Right.
thought where we emphasize contingency and contextualism and chance and arbitrariness, ironically, in light of that background, moral certainty seems to have replaced intellectual curiosity. You would think that in that postmodernist background that we would see sort of epistemic humility. If people are doubtful about truth as a meaningful category of discourse, then maybe they're going to be seekers, maybe they're going to be searchers. But no, we actually get a weird form of moral certainty and superiority coming out of these English departments. And we also get a lot of sort of quick hot takes, the Twitter version of argumentation over measured, well researched arguments. I mean, there's so many other things I could
Hmm.
talk about: grade inflation, an emphasis on the present at the expense of the past. I mean, I think that's a big issue. I have students that really know nothing before the 1960s. It's as though the 1960s were the founding generation of America, and students don't know anything about American history in particular, let alone British history, European history, Western history. And so they arrive in their classes just unable to grasp historical context or cultural references. And yet they feel equipped to judge these past works and past people by contemporary standards.
Yeah.
And they treat these historical figures and events with these just sort of um, I don't know, just these short, again, I'll use the Twitter length anecdotes rather than complex narratives that require deep understanding and deep engagement. And classical texts, also a big problem with those is if they're taught at all, they're taught, in snippets, or
Yep.
you'll read, okay, instead of reading the Odyssey, we'll read just this one, this one piece of it, or
Hmm.
we'll read just an abridged version. And part of that is just because the cultural frameworks and the textual difficulty is just too much for
Right.
students today. We just have lost the ability to read, and I'll confess, even myself, I struggle to read the way I used to find that time to get the deep reading in. Where I remember in graduate school, I would read at least a book a day
Yeah.
because I had the time to do it, and I wasn't distracted by cell phones back then, and I wasn't just obsessed with checking email, and I could sit down in the library for hours on end
Hmm.
and read without distraction. And today, my work life's busy, my travel life's busy. I actually get to read a lot on planes, so I won't complain about the travel. But
Yeah.
it's hard to find the time to get that deep engagement with important text.
Um, I do that too, the reading on the plane, and it's almost I'm looking forward to the Southwest playing the internet not working, because if the internet is working, I feel obliged to get the internet and check my emails, right? And so it's
Yeah,
all that I
sure.
celebrate. There's so much to unpack, Alan. I think I want to focus a little bit on. Um, you mentioned the moral certainty or even superiority, right? But if we're looking at just the recent kind of political moment, and you think about October 7th and kind of the response, especially on college campuses, there also seems to be such moral confusion, right? When you have students that are going on the streets with queers for Palestine, um, signs, and can't really, again, think through kind of all the implications of these signs, or you mentioned like little tweets, sound bites. Um, in your piece, you mentioned that education has eliminated moral and ethical considerations, or that we have eliminated those considerations from education. So can you maybe speak to that, how on the one hand maybe students are presented with like this moral certainty, while at the same time just being sometimes utterly confused?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there as well. I mean, it would have been incomprehensible to the ancients to separate knowledge from virtue, and I don't want what I said earlier to make it sound as if all students are somehow like dumb or something. They're not. They're very intelligent. We have students that can, maybe split atoms, but they just can't define the good. They can code algorithms, but they can't comprehend human nature. And some of this is because of the, I guess, diminishing standards, and some of it's because of the sort of dismissal of morality as a legitimate category of education. But if you divorce education from moral considerations, what you get really is just mere instruction and technique. And we're producing a lot of brilliant technicians, a lot of people that can do things very well, but they may not notice ethical problems in their work. So we might get some kind of skilled financier or bureaucrat or whatever who may be very efficient, may be very good at their tasks, but they mistake their strengths for virtue, if they even think about it in terms of virtue. And if they had that moral education, what Burke and Kirk called the moral imagination, if they had some sort of awareness of it, the capacity to understand human nature, to grasp the permanent things that make civilization possible, then we could get, I think, builders, people that don't just deconstruct or demolish or attack, but can build, can construct, who can affirm things. And civilization is not really an okay term anymore. It's considered, actually bad to use the word civilization, because it harkens back to colonialism and civilizing inferior societies or something like that. But civilization ought to be a real goal, and we ought to think of ourselves as part of a society. That we're all contributing to something. So if I'm a lawyer too, so if I'm a lawyer, I don't want to mistake legality for justice. I don't want to conflate change with progress. I want to know. I want to know about the formation of character and how to train the intellect, and how um, how to unite knowledge and wisdom rather than to separate them. I mean, these are all important things to deal with, and they're things we've lost. One thing I didn't say earlier, when you were talking about sort of the erosion of educational standards, is the death of kind of intimacy in the classroom. And what I mean is, I teach all these classes in large lecture halls, but I've done, I don't know how many Liberty Fund colloquia over the years. My classes in graduate school were seminar style, and genuine dialogue flourishes in those environments. That seminar that seminar format is just so good. We just have a few people and a professor, and you're talking over a text. But the one thing I found lately, I mean, I record my own lectures because there's always a fear of litigation or policy violations, and these prevent mentorship. These prevent real dialogue from happening. Office hours are formal, documented interactions rather than genuine intellectual exchanges, and there's just a professional distance that's replaced kind of that historic scholarly apprenticeship model. And so it's not as fun to be a professor anymore. I'll be honest. It used to be a lot of fun, but now it's almost there's almost a paralysis. I feel like we have to document all these procedures, and there are always liability concerns and institutional protocols and standardized approaches. And it's hard to just teach for the love of teaching and for students to learn for the love of learning. I'll stop. That was a very long-winded answer.
No, it was, yeah, no, I really appreciate your sharing so passionately, because clearly you care about this, right? You've dedicated your life to this and to education. And I think so often when I have guests on the podcast, many of them were not trained in liberal arts or in classical education. And then, maybe in their 20s or 30s, or when they had kids and they kind of, surveyed the landscape, they feel like they were robbed.
Yeah.
They were robbed of something. And I think what this recovery, this, some people call it classical renewal, liberal arts renewal, is trying to do is bring that back. And I think you mentioned earlier, it's not like the students are not intelligent, right, or not capable of. The CLT, our mission statement actually starts with CLT exists to reconnect knowledge and virtue, and you talked about that, right? Because we don't want to produce more clever devils, right? But this divorce is problematic. And I look at these students and I feel bad for them, but I'm not blaming them.
Right.
I'm sure there's some bad actors, right? But it's really the system. Well, the piece that you wrote, and it was very kind, about Alabama needs the classic learning test, but and I encourage everyone to read it. But what you won't find is Allen just talking about how amazing standardized testing is, and that's all we care about, right? It's really kind of what CLT stands for. And when we're talking about some of the things that have gone wrong, we can also talk about a lot of the things that have gone well. You mentioned a classical charter school now in Alabama. There's a lot of classical Christian schools. A lot of Christian schools are returning to a more liberal arts approach because they've also realized that something is wrong. And so, can you speak a little bit to kind of also the hope that you have on the K-12 side and what you've been seeing?
Well, my children go to a classical Christian school, an ACCS accredited school, about 15 minutes from my house, and I am very encouraged by the education that they're getting there, and very encouraged by just sort of the spread of classical education more broadly, whether it's specifically Christian or not. Obviously, as a person of faith, I favor the Christian approach because it informs my entire worldview, but I would much rather even secularized education get exposure to the classics, which would necessarily require the study of Christianity. You can't understand Western civilization or indeed the world we live in without some sort of deep immersion in Christian teachings. And so that's important to me. On the higher education level, I actually think that falling enrollment numbers may not be a crisis the way the media reports it, but it may be a necessary correction. This might be the market finally rejecting the false promise of universal college education and allowing us to see some new and stronger forms of education. We've got these like the Hamilton Institute, or is it the Hamilton Center? I can't remember. Center at University of Florida. But we've got them now at Tennessee, Texas, Arizona State. There are 5 new ones springing up in Ohio. And these efforts to restore classical general education curriculum, one that emphasizes Western Civ, American principles and the founding, great books, these all align with the CLT's vision of education as cultural transmission rather than social engineering. And so I celebrate these movements as well. And I think school choice that we're seeing. We just have a new a school choice act here in Alabama that passed, and this is our first year into it. And I think this will enable people from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds to have an opportunity to move to places to get the type of education that they've been deprived of in public schools. So there are a lot of things to be excited about, I think.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I- we we want to stand for something, right? We don't just want to criticize and dismiss, but cast a positive vision. And I think Jeremy and the CLT team, we've been trying to do that, right? But we also, of course, have to point out that that our competitors, the reason why we exist is because there are some disagreements, and I think you summarized some of those so well with the College Board. Can you speak to that a little bit? How maybe the College Board has contributed to this kind of educational crisis that we talked about earlier?
Sure, and I'm not exactly an expert in the College Board. I don't just monitor their everyday goings on, but I'd say if they're representative of something, it's the triumph of sort of bureaucratic quantification over genuine intellectual assessment. You know, to go a little bit negative, I might be a little bit negative, more negative than you are. I guess I have that prerogative as your guesses. I think they make the mediocre measurable while rendering the sublime, the magnificent, the interesting invisible. It's those latter things that make people curious, that make people want to learn. And I think the SAT has really devolved into sort of an exercise in tactical test taking. It's not a measure of how much you know or what your capacity is for knowing or learning. It's more of a test of how do you a test of test taking, basically.
Right.
Your knowledge, your value as an educator or as a student, your test of intellectual promise is not really in your ability to just sort of cross out wrong answers A, B, C, D, E, but really in your capacity to wrestle with questions that have no clear answers at all. And it's tough to scale and standardize that. I know the CLT has worked to do that. It's tough to reduce Lear to a series of multiple choice questions.
Absolutely.
But there has to be some type of measure, I think. But with the recognition that certain forms of knowledge really truly are immeasurable.
Hmm. And you mentioned earlier the wrestling with something that is difficult, right?
Right.
I think is it in the coddling of the American mind where Haidt talks about some of the lies that we've bought into, and dismissing what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? That we're kind of trying to avoid now. Our students should not even be exposed to anything that could challenge them, right?
Well,
Maybe
yeah.
even read something that with which they could disagree. Lord forbid.
Well, and
Right.
it's hard to like when you start what I called earlier, like the democratization of education,
Yeah.
or all texts are equal, then therefore all students writing have to be equal. And I believe the SAT has abandoned the essay portion. And that to me is just a surrender to the zeitgeist hostility towards sustained analytical writing. And, with the rise of AI and stuff, I'm sure there are ways to get around that and test administration where I know when we, for example, took the bar exam, when you're in the essay portion, you're locked out of anything but your Word document or whatever document you're
Mhm.
writing in. So there are ways to curb against cheating. But at any rate, there has to be some form of ranking writing. Some writing is better than other writing. And it's not just the ideas, it's the way ideas are articulated. One thing I dislike about legal writing um, is that it's really reduced to efficiency. You want to say as much as you can in as little as you can. If that were the case, if that were the overarching standard, we would never have a Montaigne. We'd never have these great essayists who really take you on a meandering journey through their thought process. And that to me is so much more fun and so much more edifying than, say, legal writing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I think what had bothered me so much about, whether it's College Board or ACT, is just the power that they have over curriculum,
Yeah.
right? And so when they make these changes, inevitably the schools follow. right? And
Yes.
so the vision that they cast for education, like you said earlier, the vision now is don't read any longer passage, right? So like I think
Yeah.
the new SAT is it's essentially reading a tweet, the length of a tweet,
Yeah.
and then answer a quick question. And you yourself mentioned, even for you, it has become harder to focus for a longer time, right? And so I think what we're trying to say is there's value in reading a longer paragraph. You have to apply yourself in a different way, and that's important. And so we're trying to bring that back while some of our other tests are saying, no, we're just kind of giving into the cultural moment and students can't focus anyway. So let's just have them read kind of a little snippet and answer a question. That has tremendous impact on American education, right?
It does. When
Because
people teach to the test, and I
right,
think that's the phrase. People teach to the test because I mean, students' entire lives depend on it. You know,
yeah,
they've got to get into the college they want to get into, and then once you get into that college, then you got to get the best grades. It's just I really have noticed that a lot of students that I have taught, and there are some exceptional students, but a lot of them don't really know why they're in college.
yeah,
They're just there because that's what people do, and so they have no direction, and it's a sad thing, really, because what they're looking for out of their education is merely a credential,
yeah,
and that's not about human formation. I think you mentioned Hillsdale, and I
yeah.
love Hillsdale, and
Oh, thank you.
it's just such an exceptional institution and so different from what most students are getting.
Yeah.
And I wish we had 1,000 Hillsdales.
Me too, even though it would deflate kind of my degree, right? I'm glad that there's right now only one. It's small and there's not that many, alumni. But I think I grew up in Germany, and the German word for education is Bildung, which actually translates to formation. And I
Mm.
think to me that is one of the key differences. Not, and by all means, Germany has forsaken that. So I'm not, but the word itself, right? That I think places like Hillsdale. Um, just fundamentally have a different telos on why are we doing this. It's not about credentialing, it's about forming human beings, and that impacts curricular choices, pedagogical choices, all these different things. I think you mentioned some of these classical schools, right? If and what's the name of the classical Christian school that you're
Trinity Christian School in Opelika. That's where my kids go.
there you go. If you ask them, why are we doing this, right? They probably have a different answer, and it will include the cultivation of wisdom and virtue and their formation. And yes, there are skills that they will learn. And so I think that we're trying to recover. I hope the state of Alabama does. We certainly appreciate all your support in that. I do want to, and we talked about books, and you have an extensive collection of books behind you. I want to ask you one more question, but before I do, I mentioned earlier that you are a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and you recently announced that you're joining the team at Heritage full time. Can you share with us kind of what your work is going to entail there?
Well, my role and title are to be determined. We have a few things in the works that might define what those are, but so I'll leave that. I'll kind of leave you hanging on that. But
All right,
I'm a visiting fellow now, and I'll be joining full time in May. And the
incredible.
particular capacity is sort of yet to be announced and yet
Well,
to be determined.
follow Ellen on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm sure you're gonna make that announcement. But we love Kevin Roberts and all the good folks
It's
at
great.
Heritage. Last question, the hardest. If there's one book or one text that you can point to that you would say has kind of had the most impact on your life, or maybe the trajectory of your life, what would it be and why?
Yeah, it's the one book part that makes that such a difficult question because the cop out answer is you just say the Bible or whatever because it's the foundation of my worldview. But, if you're just leaving aside that, I really, first of all, I don't think I can actually name just one because I have a lot of different works and each one marked a distinct phase in my development and altered the way I see the world. But in my high school years, I loved reading the British Romantics. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, they opened my eyes to the transcendent power of poetry and nature. When I went to college, I wanted to be a poet, and I just wrote bad poetry, so I never became a poet. I guess I was like William Faulkner. I wanted to be a poet, but I wasn't good at it, so I went with other things that I was better at. But reading The Agony and the Ecstasy before I went to Italy at age 18 was transformative. Michelangelo's works became not just masterpieces, but expressions of a profound human struggle. And then I got to go to Italy and see the products of that struggle. To Kill a Mockingbird was really important to me. My grandfather grew up in Monroeville, Alabama, with Harper Lee and Truman Capote, and had all these stories to tell me about those experiences. In college, reading Les Mis after seeing the musical was inspiring. I can't really explain to you exactly why, other than I loved how these characters lived a life of purpose, and it made me want to live a life of purpose. In economics, I discovered Mises and Hayek way too late. As an undergraduate, I had horrible economic views, and I discovered Hayek and Mises when I was living in Japan, and they were eye-opening, and I realized that everything I wanted to do economically as an undergraduate would have harmed the very people I had hoped to help. So those were important figures in my development. So in short, I don't have just one. Those are all just examples of people that were formative for me.
When it comes to books, I think cheating is okay when it comes to naming kind of the one book, Dr. Mendenhall, but that's okay. I have to ask, did To Kill a Mockingbird, did that make you want to become a lawyer? Did that have any impact
It
on
did,
that?
and to be honest, I probably wouldn't have become a lawyer were it not for that book.
Yeah.
I'm a Southerner, and I like the
Right.
idea of Atticus Finch and being a Southern lawyer in his seersucker suit and going out and ensuring justice and domestic tranquility and all the rest. But the reality of legal practice wasn't quite the same. I enjoyed my experiences in private practice to an extent, but I was very happy to get back, and I worked for the Alabama Supreme Court for a while. I worked at the Alabama Attorney General's office, but getting back into education in sort of a full-time capacity was a wonderful move for me, and I'll always be trafficking in ideas, as people say. But
Yeah.
sometimes people ask me, like, what do you do? Because your job, you got this title, but it doesn't seem like what you do. And I say, well, I'm kind of a professional conservative, and what that means is I just traffic in ideas.
Love it. I love it. I love it. Well, I appreciate you, this conversation, and all the work that you do. This was great. Again, we're here with Dr. Allen Mendenhall, professor at Troy University, and soon full time at the Heritage Foundation. Allen, I appreciate you, and God blessing to you.
Yes, you too. Thank you very much for having me.